Program, Old Pueblo Archaeology Center is delighted to present our guest speaker, archaeologist Richard Lange. Rich Lange received his undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois Urbana in 1974 and his master's degree from the University of Arizona in 1977. Shortly afterward, Rich went to work full-time for the Arizona State Museum at the University of Arizona. And in 1983, he was appointed Associate Director of the Arizona State Museum's Homol'ovi Research Program, and he continued work on that project until he retired in 2018. Rich led the archaeological survey of Homol'ovi State Park area from 1985 to 1989 and participated in the Homol'ovi Research Program excavations thereafter. He also conducted the museum's archaeological survey in the Rock Art Ranch area and directed the museum's excavations at the Multi-Kiva archaeological site south of the Rock Art Ranch. Rich's final report on the museum's work at Homol'ovi II Pueblo was published last year in the Arizona Archaeological Society's The Arizona Archaeologist Series, number 43, and is now available online through booksellers like Amazon and free in the PDF format to members of the Arizona Archaeological Society. Currently, Rich is working on other final publications for the Homol'ovi Research Project, including for the Rock Art Ranch survey and the excavation at the Multi-Kiva site. He hopes those volumes will be completed this year. His presentation this evening for Old Pueblo Archaeology Center is titled A History of Arizona State Museum Research Around Homol'ovi and at the Ancestral Hopi at the Ancestral Hopi Village of Homol'ovi II. So please welcome Old Pueblo Archaeology Center's Third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker, Rich Lange.
All righty, let's see what we can do here. I'll do mine. And there we go. I think we're in good shape now, if everybody can hear me. Thank you for joining in this evening. And thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to share over 35 years of our work from the State Museum and University of Arizona on the area near and around Winslow up in northeastern Arizona. And not only our research, but also celebrating the collaboration of other researchers and the Hopi people. As you can see, I'm formally retired, but still hanging around working on reports. And as Monica sort of mentioned, this report for Homol'ovi II just came out down along Paiute, which is the Hopi name for the Little Colorado River. And it's a 2-volume set. You can get the more expensive one with all the color plates and whatnot in it. And we're a little more reasonable price, the grayscale version. But just be careful which one you order if you go to Amazon or other booksellers to get it. So what I'll talk about is certainly the focus on Homol'ovi II Pueblo or village, and I'll also refer to it as H2. But for understanding H2, it's important to put it into context with the other villages and what else happened in the area. So on we go. Again, we're up in northeastern Arizona, and the Homol'ovi sites are just outside of Winslow here. Several of them are kind of just north of town along the river, and others a little farther upstream. These were all occupied in the late 1200s through the 1300s. And we're about 60 miles away from modern day Hopi Mesas to the north. And the basic overall conclusion for the Homol'ovi sites is that these were outposted farming villages, very important for cotton production, and similar in function to what later became a function out here along Moenkopi Wash with the Moenkopi villages that later in time sort of served the same kind of farming community relationship to other Hopi villages. The name Homol'ovi is a Hopi name that describes the local landscape. It means the place or location of small mounds and buttes, which describes that landscape around the Winslow area. And like here, Homol'ovi II Pueblo sits up on this top of this low mesa along the edge of the river. Our first work here was done by the unknown archaeologist in December of 1983. And this is a view from Homol'ovi II Pueblo out to the west. And of course, you can see the San Francisco peaks over in the Flagstaff area. We returned then in May of 1984 and did 3 more weeks worth of work with volunteers from the Arizona Archaeological Society and from Ark and Hiss, and also some Winslow school children. And these are the 5 rooms that we excavated during that time period. This was all leading up to the formal dedication of the research program and the creation of Homol'ovi State Park. After this work was completed and the program was finally approved, we hired Chuck Adams away from Crow Canyon to direct the Homol'ovi Research Program and more formally began our work in 1985. One of the partial bowls that we found during that work in 1984 became our official logo for the project. This was designed and drawn by one of our very first graduate students, Kelly Hayes Gilpin, who of course is now in the midst of her own illustrious career at Museum of Northern Arizona and Northern Arizona University. But only somebody like that with a history with the Homol'ovi Research Program would later find herself going through type collections at M&A and keep an eye on this part of the bowl. She discovered a sherd that she seemed to think probably related to something she'd seen in the past. She mailed it down, and lo and behold, they had surface collected a sherd that fit in a bowl that we found during excavation. So it changes the illustration a little bit, but not too much, but certainly shows the value and importance of keeping things in museums.
Rich, you accidentally muted.
Unmute. Okay, sorry. Okay, here we go. The Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster villages were named in an earlier publication by Chuck Adams. They consist of the 4 Homol'ovi numbered villages, as well as 3 more a little farther upstream, Cottonwood, Jackrabbit, and Chevelon. I directed the survey, as Monica noted, from 1985 to 89 to put these major pueblos into perspective more. And as part of that survey, we looked at the area that was to become the state park, as well as additional acreage here and there. And overall, we looked at another 20 square miles of landscape up there and recorded some 400 other sites. In the course of writing up that survey work, which was published in the Arizona State Museum Archaeological Series in 1998, if you want to track that down under my name, it became very clear just how important the river was to this whole enterprise of the Homol'ovi villages. And just upstream from Winslow, there are 3 permanent streams that head up along the Mogollon Rim and drain down into the Little Colorado River and provide really good water to this middle stretch of the Little Colorado. The Little Colorado heads up down here in the White Mountains around Springerville and then flows to the northwest and below Cameron finally drops into the Grand Canyon. We've discovered that the river, of course, is very important to settlement throughout all the centuries here. This big green blob in the middle of the slide sort of is the current floodplain of the river, and the main channel will meander throughout this. Each of these little squares over here are about a square mile or a mile on a side. So you can see the tremendous expanse of floodplain up here that would be very important for farming as long as the river isn't destroying what you're trying to do out there. You can see the major pueblos are either along the edges of the river, or one, Homol'ovi III, is And unfortunately, in the middle of the floodplain, and that began to dictate some of the occupation that was there as well. We discovered that the Little Colorado River is both a blessing and a curse. We were there to witness floods in 93 and 95. So almost back to back, we had what were considered 500-year floods. These are the double buttes below the visitor center area. And you can see what happened in one of those floods when it breached the levee at the mouth of the valley, and it flooded way up into the valley. And although this looks really impressive with white caps, it's only about 6 inches deep, but it does show just exactly what the river is capable of doing. This is the river down along the parking lot by Homol'ovi I Pueblo. The churning water out here was rolling big, huge clumps of trees and brush down through it. And it almost turned Homol'ovi I Pueblo, which is on this little knoll along the side of the river, almost turned it into an island, but it did overtop part of the Pueblo here. And part of the blessing of doing that is when the waters receded and began to dry out, we could suddenly see alignments of adobe brick walls and things that we had not known existed there. So very clear importance of the river, not only to us, but to the folks that were living there in the millennia past for water and for farming. One of the other major contributions of the river is it brings in driftwood via the flooding. Driftwood like this would be important not only for firewood, but also for roofing, for building pueblos and pit houses and things. We delved into a lot of environmental reconstruction, ultimately based on tree ring data that can then be matched to precipitation and stream flow information. And what we generally saw was that when it's dry, people tend to be attracted to the river because obviously it's water. But when it's more normal and above normal in terms of precip and stream flow, people tend to bail out on it, probably because the river can get out of control. But clearly things like driftwood are critical for the construction of a very large pueblo like Homol'ovi II. In the immediate area along the river, there are also many other resources. There are abundant cobble terraces that provide raw material for flake stone tools like projectile points and knives and scrapers. There's also sandstone in the buttes that are important for making groundstone tools like abraders or manos and metates, the hand and grinding stones, and also, of course, for architectural stone masonry. There are also acres and acres of sand dunes, primarily on the north and the east side of the river, blown up from the prevailing winds out of the southwest. But these are ideal, what are called dry farming situations where even today, modern day Hopi and Navajo farmers plant corn and other crops in areas like this, and they are tremendously productive. So very, very important for the prehistoric occupation of this area. In addition to all that acreage in the floodplain, we think that primarily corn and other things were being grown in the sand dunes, and that much of the floodplain was probably devoted to the production of cotton. Our occupations in the park area are primarily ceramic period occupations. So through the early and middle 4 phases, the phases are named after the predominant pottery types. So Lino black on gray, Kana'a, black mesa, and walnut black on whites. You can also see that there are fairly long ranges of occupation here. But again, going back to the stream flow and precip reconstructions, we suspect that during at least the first 4 phases in the chronology, that people are not here more than a couple years at a time. In any given 6-year time frame, there might be 1 good year, then 2 or 3 years that are kind of okay in terms of precip, and then the other years are really not much good. And it probably didn't take much to motivate people to move somewhere else to try their luck and see if they could get a little better crop out of the local environment. So we see, again, through these first 4 phases, people kind of moving in and out, and there's really not permanent occupation until the big villages are founded in this late period toward the end of the 1200s. We see occupation, this is from the early period, along the edges of the river, as well as even 5 to 6 miles back away from the river. But we kind of wonder over the centuries how much got lost out of this floodplain that would have been evidence of people making use of it. In this area, the floodplain up in here, there was once a scatter that dated to this early time period in the 600s to 800s roughly. And it's a good thing we recorded that in the 80s because the mainstream channel has since then changed course and totally scoured that out and removed that evidence. So we really don't know what's missing out of the floodplain, although clearly we suspect that it was very important. This is the pottery type from that earliest, lino black on gray, and many of the other pottery types that we see all predominantly come from to the north of the Homol'ovi area. But even at these early periods of time, they had relationships for trading and exchange with people all points of the compass around. But most of the pottery comes from the north. In the earliest period and halfway through the middle period, people are living in these very large circular pit houses. This is a 1 meter or about 3 foot long scale. So the pit house is about 4 or 5 meters in diameter and either entered with a lateral entryway or through a ladder hole coming down through the roof. And this kind of architectural tradition continues through into the first half of the middle period. And you can see in the middle period that largely they reoccupy the same kinds of ridges and places that the earliest ceramic period occupations were, but maybe a little more intensive use of the landscape back away from the edge of the river as well. But then things change radically in the second half of the middle period, both in terms of pottery and architecture. This is the Black Mesa black and white pottery, also from the north. In the first half of the middle period, it comes down from the Hopi Mesas area. But in the later part of the middle period, we get a very typical diagnostic type called walnut black on white that we know from petrographic and clay sourcing studies is made in the Hopi Buttes, which is only about halfway up to the Hopi Mesas, so a little bit closer to Homol'ovi land. So a different focus for the main pottery, and we also get a radical change in architecture. There's still pit houses, but the outer reaches of this slide are the modern day ground surface. Down in here, inside the excavation unit, about 1 foot to 18 inches down, is the prehistoric ground surface. And then dug into that is this much smaller rectangular pit house. This is that same 1 meter or 3 foot scale. You can see impressions here in the old ground surface where roof beams were laid across to roof this. These much smaller pit houses often have associated above ground storage areas, as well as interesting ventilation systems that originate at the ground surface and then open out at the floor level. Sometimes these vent systems are actually in the corners of the pit houses as well. And both of the pit houses we've just seen are in a pit house village that is right outside the back wall of the visitor center there at the park. The late period, though, reoccupies a lot of the same landscape, but much, much more heavily. The Pueblos are right along the edges of the floodplain, or again, potentially in the floodplain. And there's a veneer of this late period occupation that covers almost every site, even though they may date somewhat earlier in some cases. For a brief period of time, 30, 40 years, primarily there's a local pottery tradition that develops called Winslow orangeware. And some of the first archaeological work that was really done at Homol'ovi was done by a guy by the name of Jesse Walter Fuchs, who many of you might recognize of Eldon Pueblo and Flagstaff fame. He worked briefly in the late 1890s at Homol'ovi I and Homol'ovi III in Javelin Pueblo, and kind of concluded that work with the belief that all of the villages were founded and occupied about the same time. However, as we started working through there, and by the time we had finished our first 5, 6 years of work, we discovered that in fact Homol'ovi IV was the first of the villages. So Jesse Walter Fuchs, who numbered the Homol'ovis 1, 2, 3, 4, we think just numbered them in the order that he visited them, and has nothing to do with their occupation sequence. But Homol'ovi IV is here along the sides of the mesa and up on top. This was found at about 1260 or so and consists of about 175 rooms. And as we'll see then, Homol'ovi II is one of the last pueblos founded and doesn't arrive on the landscape until about 100 years later, about 1360. So this population, this is very much like a village of the same time frame in the late 1200s, just south of Second Mesa up at the Hopi Mesas, called Hoyapi, has the very same kinds of ceramics on it. So this was undoubtedly a group of families outposted down to this area, probably to take advantage of being able to grow things on the floodplain. Within about 20 years or so, it looks like they maybe then went back, because it looks like this village was not even occupied when Homol'ovi III came about. Homol'ovi III also has some hint of people founding it from the north, but even more clear signature of people perhaps from the south and east. The rooms are larger. There's some very large rectangular kivas out in the plaza area out here. Homol'ovi III is a little bit smaller than IV. It's only about 40 to 50 rooms, and note the largely double wide room construction of the room block here. Out in front, facing the plaza, all these little rectangular things are hars, which indicate habitation rooms, and along the back side of this would be the storage rooms. This is one of the big rectangular kivas at Homol'ovi III. This one had been impacted by the river after its occupation at some point and scoured off perhaps another third or half of this structure. It was a tremendously large kiva, as you can see from the human scales scattered on the floor there. Then just to get our bearings, we've just looked at Homol'ovi IV and III over here on this side of the river. Homol'ovi IV, again, about 1260 and gone by 1280. But about 1280, Homol'ovi III comes in, Homol'ovi I comes in, and Javelin ruin are all found at about the same time. Homol'ovi I and Javelin then continue to be occupied till almost 1400, but Homol'ovi II, Cottonwood, and Jackrabbit don't come into the picture until quite a bit later in time. So a big change in the middle of the middle period, another big change in the middle of this late period. And one of the big changes that happens here is, one, we go from villages that were only maybe 200 rooms to villages that are very quickly 500 to 1,000 rooms or more. So a tremendous influx of population. And we also get a huge amount of Jedito yellowware pottery coming down from the Hopi Mesas that totally overwhelms any other pottery type that these folks either made themselves or were getting from other areas. This is Homol'ovi I Pueblo. The original part of the Pueblo is this north Pueblo here, kind of an aggregate that it grew as accretions a little bit haphazardly. Later in the life of the Pueblo, they dismantled some of the architecture and filled in lower stories of rooms to create these small courtyards or plazas. And then at some point later in time, and maybe Homol'ovi II has something to do with this large formal plaza was added on. You can see how close the river is to this Pueblo. This is where the floods came in 93 and 95, and a lot of the adobe brick architecture was revealed down in this part of the Pueblo, although there are some adobe brick walls up here as well. But even at the time this village was occupied, they had trouble with the river because the kiva that we excavated here in the South Plaza also got flooded out at some point while it was in use. So getting in and out of your household in these pueblos, if you couldn't walk in at a ground floor level, then from the plaza or a courtyard side, you'd probably go up a ladder or steps in the masonry, get up on a rooftop, and from there drop down into a habitation room and through other doorways into other storage rooms, and then back up or maybe even through a doorway at roof level into other habitation rooms that are up closer and higher to the light and air circulation. So each person or each family would have its own suite of rooms as a household, and their entry would have been unique into their suite of rooms. This is not like some of you may know or have seen pictures of Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, where the doorways go through the entire room block, and to get from one to the other, you're going through everybody else's living room to get there. Javelin Pueblo has the same sort of history as Homol'ovi I. There's an early part of the Pueblo with a massive rooms. There's a little bit later addition where again we get some adobe brick architecture going on out here, which is really neat and important because initially a lot of archaeologists and historians thought that adobe bricks were not known in the Southwest until the Spanish got here and showed the natives how to do it. But in fact, in the Little Colorado River, even centuries earlier, when you get up into the upper Little Colorado, there's already a lot of adobe brick architecture going on. So it's nothing new when the Spanish got here. They were already doing it. But like Homol'ovi I, late in the life of Javelin Pueblo, they add on this very large plaza. And if you can see the reddening shading here over some of the room blocks, very interesting about Javelin Pueblo is when the folks left here, much of this Pueblo was intentionally burned. So then comes Homol'ovi II, and you can see in this kind of schematic view of it that it's much more formally laid out and constructed than either Homol'ovi I or Javelin were. It takes advantage of a topographic location downstream from Homol'ovi I. They had to choose a mesa that was big enough to host the anticipated size of the Pueblo, which basically from the start was clearly quite large. It seems to go up in size in the neighborhood of around 1,100 rooms or so, although probably not all of them were actually occupied all at the same time. There are also around the Homol'ovi II location ideal cliffs for rock art. We think they chose that mesa top as well as the cliffs in a sense to announce their presence. There are other rock art stands west of Homol'ovi IV, even a little rock art at Homol'ovi IV, some on some of the buttes scattered here, and then again around Cottonwood Wash Pueblo. There's not really rock art at Javelin or at Homol'ovi I, simply because there are no cliffs and panels there. but you can see in the key here that concentrated around Homol'ovi II and Cottonwood Wash Pueblo, there are also a lot of petroglyphs that have to do with mask or Kachina iconography. And these were all studied by Sally Cole. She has a publication that's also in the Arizona Archaeological Society publication series that was done a number of years ago, if you want to pursue that. This is an illustration of one of the kinds of masks, and I'm sure some of you that are rock art aficionados are just horrified by looking at this. Somebody chalked this in, which we now all know is a no-no because the chalking or action will eventually cause the rock to fall. But in this case, it's a good thing that this was documented, at least in this way, because this panel, even though it's within the park, got vandalized and has totally been rubbed out. So we would have no idea what it looked like had this photograph not been taken. These are examples of other masks and imagery around Homol'ovi II. And it's clear that Kachinas are important to what goes on in the Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster after the mid-1300s. We see it, of course, in rock art, we see it in the ceramics, and we see it in kiva murals. We also see a bit of a change in behavior that when structures are closed, they are ritually closed. This is a structure up in the north room block of the Central Plaza at Homol'ovi II. And in the corner of this room at the time, decision was made to seal it and discontinue its use. There were 3 rabbits that were put on the floor. These are fully articulated. These are not remnants of somebody's dinner. There are no butchery marks, no cooking marks. They were simply put in. And we have another instance of this at Javelin Pueblo with 3 rabbits. The ones at Homol'ovi II are on their right sides. The rabbits at Homol'ovi or at Javelin were on their left sides. But they were also sealed into this structure with axes and also a bit of a loom anchor. So a very formal closing and sealing of this structure. We have evidence of a couple of murals at Homol'ovi II. This one is over in Akiva in the East Plaza. We recognized this as well and had it confirmed when some Hopi elders visited that this is undoubtedly a rendition of the San Francisco peaks. You can see the peaks here and trailing off match the skyline of what's visible out to the west. And the Hopi elders felt this would be the sun watchers structure, where by running a potsherd along the floor or a stick or some other marker, the sun watcher would track where the setting sun is relative to the peaks in order to time out various events and ceremonies that would be important to the village. So let's look at the occupation of the landscape here as we get closer and closer to the time that Homol'ovi II appears there. So first, Homol'ovi IV and III are founded, as well as Homol'ovi I down here. But there are Homol'ovi III and I and Javelin are all founded at the beginning of what is called the Great Drought, roughly the last quarter century of the 1200s. And as noted, people would be attracted here when it's dry and not so much when it's normal or above normal. I'm going to drop a couple of X's in here over Homol'ovi IV because it didn't exist anymore at 1280, Homol'ovi II because it doesn't exist yet. And we can posit a rough boundary between the area controlled and farmed by Homol'ovi III and the area controlled and farmed by Homol'ovi I. So after the Great Drought in the early 1300s, when stream flow suddenly resumed, suddenly Homol'ovi III was probably not the most ideal situation to be. So I'm guessing that Homol'ovi III largely moved into Homol'ovi I and joined up with the growth of that pueblo and began to hang out with those folks. Therefore, it left an area downstream open, and probably the folks from Homol'ovi III were still involved in farming that. But as farming of cotton became much, much more important in the trade networks in exchange for yellowware pottery coming down from the mesas or obsidian coming from the Flagstaff area, there was clearly pressure to develop more housing. And my guess is that the same people that controlled this area were the ones that staked out Homol'ovi II Pueblo as a way to increase the population along here and maintain their ancestral control of that part of the floodplain. It also clearly involved population coming down from the Hopi Mesas, but we also know that the Hopi Mesas were not depopulated. So it also involved population coming in from other areas elsewhere around the Colorado Plateau. And we can begin to see how that rapid growth occurred at Homol'ovi II by looking at how we've reconstructed what's happened at these other villages. There were drought years for about 20 years between 1335 and 1355, and then suddenly renewed higher stream flows 1356 to 1359. And what that would have done is brought in probably new tremendous loads of driftwood that would have supplied the construction and need for firewood and things at Homol'ovi II, because after all, the rest of the floodplain had been picked over for over half a century by the folks that had been living at Homol'ovi III and Homol'ovi I. So once Homol'ovi II comes into existence, again about 1360, the permanent settlement of the Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster ends in the mid-1390s or so. What triggered that is there are severe floods that we think happened in about 1382 and 84, followed by 10 years of drought. So it would have first destroyed any of the field systems and maybe small canals or diversions that were in the floodplain, and then suddenly stopped raining for a while. People probably said, I'm tired of this, we're out of here. And many of them went and joined up to villages that are at the Hopi Mesas, that if we think 1,000, 1,100 rooms is big at Homol'ovi, some of the villages out on Antelope Mesa, like Owatovie, quickly grew to 5,000 rooms or so. So once Homol'ovi II is founded, 1360, it only has about 30 years to grow. So all of this stuff happened very quickly. Our initial map came from some work from the Museum of Northern Arizona in the early 1980s before we got there. And it shows a very formal arrangement of the room blocks, entries, gaps in the room blocks into the plazas. But as we did our work there and I began writing up the report, suddenly some of this wasn't making a lot of sense. So we went back up very quickly in 2013 and 14 and remapped the entire Pueblo and also opened up all the structures that we'd excavated in the early 90s to understand better how the rooms went together. And this is now how we think it went, that there in fact is an entry into the Western Plaza at this corner. There are two corridors into the Central Plaza and maybe a third up here, but we now don't know. The sidewalk for the park goes up and is parked right over the top of this part of the room block, so it's hard to tell whether these are connected or not. But that's the basic layout. And where we have worked there, here are the 5 rooms that we did in 1984. We excavated a couple of kivas in the West Plaza, several more kivas in the Central Plaza, like the 5 rooms that are still open. This big kiva is still open and visible to the public there. We excavated a swath of rooms through the north room block up here, another swath of rooms through the south room block down here, explored some extramural areas, and an outside area that turns out to have been a very large ramada or porch all along the south side of the Pueblo. We excavated a kiva. This is where the mural of the peaks is over here in the East Plaza, as well as parts of a couple of storage rooms over here. So when Homol'ovi II first started, it was not the first thing on this mesa top. Underneath a couple of the rooms up here in the north room block, we discovered earlier pit houses that date to the late 1100s into the early 1200s. And there are also potentially some other masonry structures just outside of this ramada area along the south edge. There are foundations for other stone masonry rooms that were dismantled. There are fits and starts of the room block alignments here in this major south room block that seem to have been dismantled and redone. There are also a couple of places where in the bottoms of the vandal holes in some of the rooms, we see very different wall alignments, and this one clearly was at least several rooms long that indicate there may have been earlier small room blocks up on this same mesa top, but clearly when Homol'ovi II arrived and somebody had the grand plan for how they wanted to build this thing, those things got dismantled and the main construction started. It looks like the first room blocks were probably along what became the central plaza. And remember the double wide construction back at Homol'ovi III, here it is again. Very quickly thereafter, they added another set of rooms in front, and the original room blocks were increased up to 2 stories in height. Maybe those things happened simultaneously, maybe not, we're not totally sure. Then very quickly, the new room blocks also went up to 2 stories, and there was an extension that seems to be part of this same construction that continued this room block out much farther and added on an end. So at one time, this plaza area defined by these 3 room blocks was a tremendously large plaza. But equally interesting is that this never got built up to 2nd stories and nothing else was done here. In fact, it seems like fairly early, this was dismantled. Roofing beams were probably taken out and recycled into other construction. Maybe even some of the stone masonry was taken down, but largely the room blocks over on what became the East Plaza went out of use. One of the other interesting changes is that in the initial 2 rooms, there were probably plaza side doorway entrances into the room blocks, and then other doors that allow you into the back rooms for storage, like we saw at Homol'ovi III again. But very quickly, when they start adding on rooms in front, these no longer have ground floor entries. They may have had pole entries, as I showed in the earlier slide, to go up. There may have been doorway entries up here, but it very radically changed the access into the room blocks. The new room blocks that were built that formed the West Plaza and then shrunk the size of the Central Plaza, in essence, clearly the number of rooms that are built here would have handled this population if it repositioned itself within the village, but also was built to house a lot of new people coming in from other places. So after the initial construction, these also went very quickly to 2 stories. And then the final thing was to close off part of the West Plaza and leave an opening here, and to close off most of the Central Plaza, but leave a very narrow corridor in this area, as well as an entry in here. And again, we're not so sure about that corner of the plaza. But when this is all said and done, this is kind of the final configuration of Homol'ovi II. And in some ways, it's kind of reminiscent of the two main parts of the Pueblo at Homol'ovi I and Javelin Pueblos as well. So we'll divert here and go over a few details of artifacts and a little bit more on architecture. During the course of the project, one of the neat things that came along was what's called Instrumental Neutron Activation Analysis, or INAA, or NAA for short. And Jettido Yellowware pottery made at the Hopi Mesas when it was one of the early focus of this new type of analysis, largely because it is made without temper, so there's not a lot of extra stuff in there that might distract the machinery. But this technique has the ability to measure down to parts per million diagnostic elements that would match clay sources to a pot made from that clay. And in order to sample the pottery, all we have to do is burr off a tiny patch and turn it into powder, and that's what gets submitted to the lab, and they can do that analysis. Another thing that came along was a study by LeBlanc and Henderson published in 2009 called Symbols in Clay. One of the characteristics of Jettido Yellowware bowls is on their exteriors, they have exterior design elements, EDEs. Sometimes they're just one, other times there are two on opposite sides, or symmetrically three or even four. And even more rarely, there's a complete band all the way around the outside. But you can see two different bowls, why people thought these might represent some sort of maker's mark. If you're being really picky though, this one has 4 peaks and 3 peaks. This pot has 4 peaks and 4 peaks, plus a funny little scroll on the edge of it. So maybe these are maker marks, maybe these are families of potters. This might be the grandmother, this might be the daughter or granddaughter. Hard to tell, but that's one possible interpretation. And so running with this data, we looked at first the NAA data from Yellowware at the Hopi Mesa, or at the Homol'ovi sites, and most of the pots seem to be made up here on Antelope Mesa, or at the various villages that are here. This is up at Hopi, out toward the Keams Canyon area. So sourcing study-wise, we know the majority of pots were made on the Antelope Mesa area. When we look at the EDE designs, those exterior designs, we can see how the different shares come about from the villages. Homol'ovi shares 35 different designs with miscellaneous other villages up at the Hopi Mesas or down at Homol'ovi. Kwaika shares 64 different ones. And you can see how the matches go from Homol'ovi I to matches at many different mesas. So these things were getting passed out and around, and this is part of what lends some difficulty in terms of interpreting exactly what these EDEs are in terms of maker marks or family marks. They're made at different mesas, probably. They're made over extended periods of time, clearly beyond the life of one potter. So it's a little bit difficult, and I'll come back to this a little bit later in the talk here. I'll move to talking about a term that I applied to simply the alteration or modification of an object or a material or a sediment. These things are processed, that is altered in some way, and applies to ceramics, pottery, as well as to stone axes, the ground stone, to architecture, as well as human remains. As we started reassembling pots that we had found in our excavations, we began to discover a very distinctive feature that I ultimately ended up calling a dip, or a deliberate impact point. Those of you who had BB guns when you were little and remember what you got in trouble for when you shot at a window by accident, it creates these very distinctive little spalls. This pot was broken, but not by roof fall or wall fall, but by being purposely struck on the exterior by a cobble or maybe a wooden wand. And we see these kinds of characteristic, purposeful breakage of vessels. But then the question becomes to dip or not to dip. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. So not every vessel was treated the same way. This is a kiva at Homol'ovi II. You can see this is the other mural besides the San Francisco peaks. There were some figures, probably Kachina figures of some sort, in the plaster along here. This was excavated by an amateur archaeologist in the early 1960s. And fortunately, we have ended up with most of the pots in the collections at the Arizona State Museum. But when we looked at these carefully and matched them to the way he had numbered the vessels as he found them, there are a set of vessels that were put in above the bench when this structure was closed and taken out of regular use. And all the vessels that were stacked in the corners were not deliberately broken. Many of the ones that are on the floor, however, were. So sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I also had the opportunity to look at a bunch of vessels from Kauai, ancestral village up on Antelope Mesa, again at the Hopi Mesas. And same thing, some of those were had deliberate impact points and some did not. So it's done sometimes and not other times. In the axes, initially we might have thought, well, maybe this was just a breakage when somebody was chopping something. But you can see from the size of this axe, it had a tremendous amount of life used in it. If this had been an accident while chopping something, it would have been relatively easy to just repolish the bit and keep on using it. But we see these things deposited with purposeful alterations also. This is the flake taken off the bit. This axe, I think these two came from the same room with the rabbits. This one, the pole was broken off of it. This is a complete one. So again, sometimes they're treated this way and sometimes they're not. We can see in the distribution of groundstone, each of these little boxes here scattered around the site has numbers for monos on the top, complete and fragmentary, and metates on the bottom, complete and fragmentary. You can see there are not many broken or complete monos or metates in any of the main structures, but the numbers go up considerably when you see the numbers from the kivas. And so again, they are purposefully breaking things and putting them into particular deposits as part of the closing of the structures. Architecturally, we seem to see the same activities happening. In a kiva like this, when it is closed and sealed off so that it protects other members from the village from getting into things that they shouldn't get into or don't know about. The ventilator shaft, which originates up here on the ground surface, they come down behind the wall and the bench. Some of them have openings above the bench, as well as in the face of the bench. They come out to provide fresh air and circulation into the kiva and above the fireplace. But the ventilator shafts are without fail very formally closed. They're often crystals and canid, that is dog skulls or jaws put in there. This has a big utility jar broken over the hearth and a couple of big loom blocks or loom anchors placed over it as well before some of the walls were pushed in and this kiva was taken out of commission. We find human remains occasionally in the fill of structures like this, and it may just be that these are accidental inclusions. The burials are around the edges of the Pueblo, often excavated into the trash areas, and we don't target those, of course, in our own excavations, but as they collected fill to maybe throw in, it's possible they picked up a random element or two and those got deposited, or they may be very intentional selections of particular elements from a particular individual to maintain the relationship of that individual and that particular structure or deposit. But the one thing that we have at Homol'ovi II is a different thing from the other villages, is we also have some articulated human remains that we had not intended to find. This phrase is basically what gives people in the Western religious world, gives the religious leaders license to kill. This comes out of the King James Version, this particular phrasing of the Bible. Witches and witchcraft are worldwide. Those of you that, like me in high school, probably had to read Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Some of the individuals that appear in that story are on my family tree and were on the wrong end of the Salem witchcraft trials in the early 1600s in New England. Witchcraft is perhaps better known with the Navajo, thanks to Tony Hillerman, but it's also well documented during Spanish colonial times, for instance, at Nam Bay and the Rio Grande Valley area of New Mexico. It occurred throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, and it occurs all over the world, even in the present day. Witchcraft and accusations of witchery are probably related to stress, the stress that may come from aggregating these large communities, or even petty jealousies. Some of the transgressions that seem to be punished by witchcraft are even far less severe than what we have codified as capital punishment in the modern Western world. If you want to read more about witchcraft and all that good stuff at Homol'ovi, take a look at Bill Walker, who was a former graduate student of ours, now at New Mexico State University. His U of A dissertation concerned witches and identification of witchcraft. So Homol'ovi II, as I said, is the only one of the Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster villages that we've worked in that's had things like this. In a kiva, in one of the plazas, were 3 individuals. There are 2 juveniles, this one young teens, this one preteen, and another woman in her 20s might possibly be the mother of these individuals, but she has been processed in a sense, in that she, after death, her lower right leg and foot were removed. They do not appear in this same structure. You can also see the impact points in the flagstones, where after these individuals were deposited into the kiva, that huge stones were thrown in on top of them. And then there was a very thick clay and caliche seal put into this structure. In another kiva, in another plaza, there's a young male, a little bit older, but probably still in his 20s, appears to have his head up the ventilator shaft to suck fresh air as they burned the kiva down on top of him. There are also a couple of arrow points that were in what would have been the fleshy parts of the body. And remember, again, this is a short relatively short, a generation, maybe a little bit more of occupation at Homol'ovi II. These were done in the plazas, in the kivas, central out in the middle of the village. There is no way this could have been hidden and concealed from the populace. So these are clearly people that were accused of something and being made examples of. I'll wrap this up, getting back to Yellowware just real quick from Homol'ovi II. Back to our exterior designs, and the other thing that caught my eye as I was putting together data on the exterior design elements. There are lots of pots that I know art is kind of in the eye of the beholder. This is not the most perfectly symmetrical pot. It's not the evenest around the rim, but yet the design work on the interior and the exterior is very, very crisp and clean, clearly done by an expert painter. But we also have pots that may have really, really good design execution on the inside, and then on the outside is a little bit rougher and coarser. And again, looking at the pots from Kwaika, when I was able to look at those, as well as all of our pots from Homol'ovi I and II and Javelin, we get every kind of mixture. It's not that they were hoarding the good pots at the Hopi Mesas and trading the junk out or vice versa, but we get pots with good interiors and good exteriors, good interiors and not so good exteriors, bad interiors, bad exteriors, good and good. So all combinations. What this led me to is I can't quite conceive of one artist who's good enough to paint this kind of thing on the inside than doing something like this on the outside. What we know is that in the mid-1300s, Jetado Yellowware was a commodity that was traded all over the Southwest. There are even some in the Tucson Basin. They were clearly cranking out these pots as fast as they could make them. And I think what this indicates is that there were multiple individuals involved in the creation and decorating of pots. There may have been one individual that formed the pot, somebody else who painted the interior, and somebody else who painted the exterior. But I think Jetado Yellowware are some of the best examples we have of multiple artists creating Jetado Yellowware, especially the bowls. Interestingly, about 1385, when what we call polychrome or multicolored vessels come into vogue, you get the same black on yellow, but the fill is done with a reddish orange or light brown color. And many of these seem to be done much more carefully and may indicate that as we get later and later on in the 1300s and even into the 1400s, beyond the time that the Homol'ovi sites were occupied, that the pottery production has been taken over by specialists who care a little bit more. Clearly, it's not just a difference between jar forms and bowl forms. There are also jars that look like I could have painted them rather than somebody who really knows what they're doing. Some of this polychrome work is also reminiscent of the source of people that we think may be coming from the south and east. Diagonally here, this is White Mountain Redware from Show Low, Springerville, down toward Grasshopper and Cibecue. Much better executions, some of the same kind of banding and exterior designs. Across this diagonal is some of that Winslow orangeware that show that early on there may indeed have been potters moving in who really knew what they were doing, but very different kind of traditions than what happens in the Yellowware. So all of this is in the report. Pick one up online and enjoy, or at least it may cure your insomnia. So for a few minutes here, just to wrap things up, I'm going to talk about Rock Art Ranch and the other part of the trip that we hope to do in early June. So maybe I'll see some of you there. Rock Art Ranch, of course, is known for its extensive rock art at the steps in Javelin Canyon. And Rock Art Ranch and our study area are not all that far apart. Here's Winslow, the downtown Homol'ovis 1 through 4. A little bit farther upstream are these things that are no more than 5-10 miles away from the Rock Art Ranch area. So we thought when we started working here at Rock Art Ranch, we'd be seeing pretty much the same thing. However, we got a bunch of much earlier sites than we had found in downtown Homol'ovi. There are sites and projectile points here along the major canyons. They go back to Paleo-Indian times and in the millennia before the ACDC or AD-BC border. So very intensive land use by archaic and pre-ceramic peoples. We have some of the early ceramic period occupation. You can see them moving away from the canyons as there's more interest in farming. And this continues into the Pueblo III period, say into the early mid-1200s or so. But given that we are just right near Homol'ovi and all that Jetito yellowware at Rock Art Ranch, we have essentially none. So we traded in our ceramic typologies for projectile point typologies, lots of neat points from very early in time, archaic, made of petrified wood, some of which may be local, or some may come from over around the petrified forest at Holbrook. But what we think this is indicating is that there are things moving around on the landscape, at least different point styles. Here in the red circle is the Homol'ovi and Rock Art Ranch area. We are right at the intersection where we may have people already living there that are adopting agriculture coming up from the southern southwest, or even maybe the population moving in from points to the south. We shall see. As we said, we're working on that report still. It may be out later this year or certainly by next year. And we'll see if we can figure that all out by then. And with that, I'll turn it back to our moderators and we can go to any questions that may have shown up. So.
Thank you, Rich. Your presentation was fascinating and very informative. I knew very little about these sites, so I'm feeling enriched. Thank you.
Okay.
And hopefully someday I'll